She carried a promise in an envelope and all she owned in a single carpet bag. The train ticket said Redemption Creek, Montana, the new start she had prayed for. But after 3 days waiting on a splintered bench, Eleanor Vance was beginning to understand that some prayers are never answered. The wind had a bite to it, a cold reminder that spring in the Montana Territory was a fickle thing. It swept down from the jagged peaks of the mountains, rattling the loose pane of glass in the station window and tugging at the frayed hem of her gray wool dress. Redemption Creek's train station was hardly a station at all. It was a drafty, one-room shack. Its walls were thin enough to hear the secrets of the wind. A pot-belly stove stood cold and rusted in one corner, a silent monument to winters past. The bench along the wall was too hard for comfort and too short for sleep. Eleanor knew this intimately. She had tried. Inside her gloved hands, she clutched a letter. The paper was worn soft along the creases from being folded and unfolded 100 times. The ink, once a bold declaration of a new life, now seemed faded, mocking. It promised a husband, a Mr. Jacob Bennett. It promised a small but sturdy home near the creek. It promised an end to the loneliness that had been her only companion since her parents had passed. She approached the station master's window for what felt like the 10th time. Mr. Gable was a kind man, with a face like a weathered map and eyes that held a weary sympathy. He was already shaking his head before she spoke. "Are you sure, Mr. Gable?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost lost in the whistling of the wind. "Jacob Bennett. He said he had a small claim just north of town." The old man sighed, polishing a pair of spectacles with a corner of his vest. "Ma'am, I've been the station master here for 25 years. I know every soul in this valley and every soul that's passed through it. There's no Jacob Bennett here. Never has been." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I've asked around quiet-like. No one's heard the name. Are you certain this is the right town?" Her heart, a small, frightened bird in her chest, fluttered painfully. She smoothed the envelope on the counter, pushing it toward him. The address was clear. Jacob Bennett, Redemption Creek, Montana Territory. It had an official-looking stamp from a correspondence agency back in St. Louis. It had felt so real. The hope it sparked had been the only warmth she'd felt for the entire journey west. Now, that warmth was gone, replaced by a familiar, chilling dread. "You should come inside for a bit," Mr. Gable offered gently. "Another storm's blowing in. It's no night to be sitting out on that bench." She gave him a small, tight smile. "Thank you, but I prefer the air." The truth was, she couldn't bear the pity in his eyes a moment longer. She couldn't bear the 4 walls of the shack that felt more like a cage with every passing hour. She walked back outside and sat down, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. That was the end of day 3. Hope was a fragile thing, she thought, easily broken. Day 4 dawned gray and cold. Eleanor ate the last of her dried biscuits, chewing slowly to make them last. Her stomach ached with a hunger that was deeper than a lack of food. It was a hunger for belonging, for a place to finally set down her bag and rest. Her fine, blonde hair, usually pinned in a neat braid, had strands that had escaped, whipped loose by the constant wind. She felt as messy and unkempt as her situation. The townspeople of Redemption Creek had begun to notice her. They were a hardy folk, carved from the same unforgiving landscape that surrounded them. They passed by in their wagons and on horseback, their glances a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A few of the women, gathered by the town's only well, would stop their chatter when she drew near. Their whispers followed her like shadows. Another one, she heard a woman with a severe bonnet say, "That's the second this season." "Poor thing," another clucked. "She has that look in her eye. The hopeful kind. It's always the hopeful ones who get hit the hardest." Eleanor pretended not to hear. She held her head high, filled her bucket with trembling hands, and walked back to the station. She was too proud to let them see her cry, but the tears burned behind her eyes. She had left her life as a governess in a stuffy Boston home for this. She had sold the last of her mother's heirlooms to pay the agency fee and buy her ticket. She had nothing and no one to go back to. This was meant to be her final stop. On the 5th morning, Mr. Gable brought her a tin cup of hot coffee. It was bitter, but it was warm, and she cradled it in her hands, grateful for the small kindness. "No word?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He shook his head, his expression grim. "I'm starting to think this Jacob Bennett was never real, ma'am. We get scoundrels passing through. Men who find it amusing to write false letters to lonely women. A cruel sort of prank. He spat on the ground, his disgust clear. Happened to a girl last year. She left on the next train east, weeping the whole way. Eleanor's grip tightened on the cup. The thought that her desperation, her very hope, could be someone's cruel joke was a new kind of violation. She looked out at the distant mountains, where the promise of a new life had once seemed so certain. Now they just looked like a wall she could never climb. "When is the next train east?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "Tomorrow afternoon." She nodded slowly. "Then I will wait. Just a little longer. Not for Jacob Bennet. He was a ghost, a fiction. She was waiting for a miracle now, though she had long since stopped believing in them. "You don't deserve this, miss," the station master said, his voice thick with sympathy. She managed a faint smile. "Most people don't deserve what they get, Mr. Gable. Good or bad." That afternoon, she stood by the fence that separated the station from the vast, empty prairie. She was watching a hawk circle high in the sky, a lonely speck in an endless blue. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the small figure approaching until a tiny hand tugged on the fabric of her skirt. She looked down. A little girl, no older than 6, stood there. She wore dusty leather boots that were far too big for her feet, swallowing her small ankles. Her dark hair was woven into 2 messy braids, and her face was smudged with dirt. But it was her eyes that held Eleanor's gaze. They were a startling shade of green, serious and direct, with a wisdom that didn't belong in such a small child. "Are you the waiting lady?" the girl asked, her voice clear and without shyness. Eleanor was taken aback. "Pardon, my papa calls you that. He saw you from the wagon. He said you look like you're waiting for something that ain't ever coming." The girl tilted her head. "Are you?" A dry, humorless laugh escaped Eleanor's lips. "Yes, I suppose I am. But I believe I'm done waiting now." The little girl considered this for a moment. She looked Eleanor up and down, from her worn boots to her tired face. Then she asked a question that would change the course of Eleanor's life. "My mommy went to be an angel 2 summers ago," she said, as if stating a simple fact, like the color of the sky. "I don't have one anymore." She paused, taking a small, courageous breath. "Please, will you be my mommy?" Eleanor froze, the wind knocked out of her. Of all the things she had expected to hear on this desolate train platform, this was not one of them. She stared at the child, at the impossible sincerity in her eyes. The question was so absurd, so raw, so heartbreakingly direct. What?" she stammered. "Papa says he doesn't need a new wife," the girl continued, undeterred. "He says we do just fine on our own. But he's wrong. His coffee is terrible, and he doesn't know how to braid hair right. And sometimes at night, the house is too quiet." She took another step closer, her gaze unwavering. "You look nice. You look like you know how to make things quiet in a good way. Like you could fill up the empty spaces." Before Eleanor could form a coherent thought, the little girl reached out and took her hand. The child's fingers were small and warm, a startling contrast to the cold that had settled deep in Eleanor's bones. "Come on," the girl insisted. "Papa's in the general store. You can meet him. Then you can come home with us." "Wait, little one," Eleanor said, finding her voice. "It's not that simple. I don't even know your name." "It's Abigail," she said brightly. "But everyone calls me Abby. And my papa is Samuel Miller. He's sad a lot, but he's a good man. He just needs a little help remembering how to smile." Abby tugged on her hand again, a surprising strength in her small frame. "Please, it's a long walk back to the ranch. You can't let me walk alone, can you?" Eleanor looked down at their joined hands. She looked at Abby's earnest, pleading face. For 5 days, she had been met with pity, whispers, and the crushing weight of a lie. She had been left, abandoned before she had even arrived. She had lost everything. And now, this small child was offered what? A way out. A different kind of promise? It was madness. Utter madness. But as she stood there, on the verge of refusing, of explaining the impossibility of it all, she felt that small, warm hand tighten around hers. It was the first genuine, human warmth she had felt since she'd stepped off that train. After days of sitting on a cold bench, waiting for a ghost, a child's hand felt like an anchor in a storm. She hesitated for only a moment longer. Then, Against all reason, against all logic, she nodded. "All right, Abigail," she heard herself say. "I'll walk with you." A brilliant smile lit up the little girl's face, transforming her serious expression into one of pure, unbridled joy. "I knew it," she declared. "I told Papa an angel might be waiting at the train station." Eleanor didn't feel like an angel. She felt like a fool, following a child on a whim. But as they walked away from the lonely station and toward the center of town, for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't looking back. The walk to the Miller Ranch felt like a journey to the edge of the world. Abigail kept up a steady stream of chatter, pointing out landmarks with the confidence of a seasoned guide. That was the blacksmith shop, where Mr. Henderson made sparks fly like angry fireflies. That was the creek where she caught frogs in the summer. And up there, on the ridge, was where the eagles sometimes nested. Eleanor listened, offering quiet murmurs of encouragement. Each step took her further from the train station, further from the life that had crumbled into dust. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, a homestead came into view. It was nestled in a shallow valley, protected by a stand of tall pines. There was a sturdy-looking farmhouse, its white paint peeling in places, tired but standing firm against the elements. A large barn leaned slightly to one side, as if weary from years of holding its ground. 2 horses stood in a corral, their tails swishing in the evening breeze. A handful of chickens pecked at the dirt near the porch. It was a place that spoke of hard work and solitude. As they approached, a man stepped out onto the porch. He was wiping his hands on a rag, his movements slow and deliberate. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his work shirt. His hair was dark, his face angular and weathered, as if it had been carved from the very rock of the mountains behind him. His eyes, when they lifted to meet hers, were the color of a stormy sky, and they held no welcome. "Abby," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't angry, but it was flat, devoid of warmth. "I told you to wait for me in the store." Abigail ran ahead, unabashed. "I know, Papa, but I found her. I found the angel from the station." The man's gaze shifted to Eleanor. He took in her dusty dress, her wind-tangled hair, her carpet bag held tightly in her hand. His expression did not change. There was no curiosity, no surprise, only a deep, unyielding weariness. "I didn't send for a bride," he said, his words clipped and final. Eleanor felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. The sheer absurdity of the situation crashed down on her. What was she doing here? She was a stranger, dragged to this man's home by his fanciful daughter. She clutched the handle of her bag, her knuckles white. But then she looked at Abby, who was now hiding slightly behind her father's legs, peeking out at her. The hope in the little girl's eyes was a tangible thing. Eleanor straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. "No, you didn't," she said, her voice clearer than she expected. "But Ezra Whitlow did. Or at least, he pretended to." She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not recognition, but perhaps understanding. "It seems I've been made a fool of, Mr. Miller. Your daughter was simply kind enough to offer me a walk out of town instead of a seat on a cold bench." The man, Samuel, seemed to consider this. He looked from Eleanor to his daughter and back again. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whispering through the pines. "The house is cold at night," he said finally, not to her, but as if speaking to the air itself. "And the fire needs tending." He gestured vaguely toward the house with his head. "You can take the cot in the spare room, just for the night. The eastbound train doesn't leave until tomorrow afternoon." It was not an invitation. It was a statement of fact, a temporary solution to a problem he hadn't asked for. But it was more than she'd had for 5 days. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered. She followed him inside. The interior of the house was clean but sparse. The furniture was handmade, sturdy and functional, with no frills or comforts. A thick layer of dust coated the mantelpiece, where a single, empty picture frame stood. There were no curtains on the windows, leaving the panes like dark, empty eyes staring out into the twilight. It was a house that was lived in, but it did not feel like a home. It felt like a place where someone was waiting. Or perhaps, a place where someone had stopped waiting altogether. Samuel showed her to a small room off the kitchen. It contained a simple cot, a wash basin on a stand, and a single wooden chair. "The blanket is in the chest," he said from the doorway, before turning to leave. He paused, his back still to her. "My wife, Mary, she died in childbirth 2 years ago." He didn't say it with emotion. He said it like he was reciting a fact from an almanac. Then he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone in the quiet, shadowed room. She sat on the edge of the cot, the springs groaning in protest. She hadn't realized how exhausted she was until that moment. The weight of the past week, the past year, settled on her like a physical burden. She had come west seeking a home, and had found only heartbreak and a stranger's reluctant charity. She would stay the night, and in the morning, she would walk back to town and take the train. It didn't matter where it went. Anywhere was better than this limbo. She would leave at sunrise, before they awoke. It would be easier that way. Her bag was packed before the first hint of dawn colored the sky. Her boots were laced tight. Her mind braced for the long walk back to town, back to the life of an unwanted stranger. She had lain awake most of the night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house, the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the wind, the profound and echoing silence that seemed to fill every corner. But as she stepped quietly into the main room, a sound stopped her. A soft, wheezing cough, followed by a small, pitiful whimper. "Miss Eleanor." The voice was hoarse and weak. Eleanor turned toward the sound. Abigail sat curled in the doorway of her own small bedroom, a miserable ball of blankets. Her cheeks were flushed with fever, her eyes glassy and wet. Her usually boundless energy was gone, replaced by a fragile weariness. Eleanor rushed to her side and knelt, placing a hand on the girl's forehead. It was hot to the touch, alarmingly so. "Oh, you poor dear," she whispered. "You're burning up. You should be in bed." "I feel icky," Abby mumbled, a tear tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. "My throat hurts." Eleanor looked toward Samuel's closed bedroom door. There was no sound. Without a second thought, she scooped the little girl into her arms. She had never held a child before, and the motion felt awkward, clumsy. But Abby didn't seem to notice. She sagged against Eleanor, her small head resting on her shoulder, clinging to her shirt with a weak but determined grip. She carried Abby back to her bed and tucked the covers around her. Just then, Samuel appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sounds. He was dressed for the day's work, but he stopped short, his body going rigid. A tightness settled around his jaw. "She's sick," he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded, smoothing the hair back from Abby's hot forehead. "She has a fever. It feels quite high." He crossed the room in 2 long strides and leaned over the bed, his large, calloused hand briefly touching his daughter's cheek. His face, usually a mask of stoicism, was clouded with a raw, undeniable worry. As he straightened up, Abby whimpered and reached a hand out, not for her father, but for Eleanor. Samuel saw the small gesture. His gaze flickered to Eleanor, and a complex emotion crossed his face: surprise, confusion, and something else she couldn't name. "She wants you," he said, his voice quiet, almost rough with disbelief. "She never takes to strangers." Eleanor took Abby's small hand in her own. The little girl's fingers curled around hers, a trusting, desperate grip. In that moment, the thought of the train, of leaving, vanished from her mind. "Then maybe I'll stay," she heard herself say. The words came out before she had time to consider them. "Just until she's better." Samuel hesitated. He looked at his daughter, so small and frail in her bed. He looked at this strange woman who had appeared out of nowhere, a woman his child was now clinging to, as if she were a lifeline. He seemed to be having a silent argument with himself. Finally, he gave a single, curt nod. "There's broth and dried herbs in the pantry," he said, his tone all business once more. "If you know what to do with them." "I was a governess for 5 years," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "I know how to care for a sick child." He turned and left without another word. That set the tone for the days that followed. Eleanor stayed, not for the grim, silent man who was the master of the house, but for the little girl who fought a fever in her small bed. She moved about the quiet house with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. She brewed teas from the herbs she found, forcing the bitter liquid past Abby's lips. She cooled her forehead with damp rags. She read to her from the only book she could find, a worn family Bible, not for the scripture, but for the soothing rhythm of the words. Abby would listen, her eyes heavy-lidded, clutching Eleanor's sleeve as if afraid she would disappear. Life on the ranch was harder than anything Eleanor had ever known. Her soft hands, accustomed to holding books and pencils, quickly blistered from pumping water from the well and scrubbing laundry on a washboard. Her back ached from tending the small vegetable garden. She learned to feed the chickens, milk the cow, and knead dough for bread, all under the silent, watchful eye of Samuel Miller. He never thanked her. He rarely spoke to her at all, and when he did, it was in short, practical instructions. The wood box is empty. The west fence needs mending. Watch the stove. He never used her name, referring to her only as you. But she saw him watching. When she sat by Abby's bed, humming a lullaby her own mother had once sung to her, she would feel his presence in the doorway, a shadow lingering for just a moment before retreating. When she managed to coax a few spoonfuls of broth into Abby, she saw the flicker of relief in his eyes before he turned away. And one evening, when Abby was finally strong enough to sit at the kitchen table, and a small smile touched the girl's lips at something Eleanor said, she saw Samuel pause on his way out the door, his expression unreadable. He was a man encased in grief, a fortress of his own making. But Eleanor was beginning to see the cracks. Abby's fever broke on the fourth day. The color returned to her cheeks, and her bright, inquisitive spirit slowly re-emerged. She followed Eleanor around the house and yard like a small shadow, chattering away, asking endless questions. Why is the sky blue, Miss Eleanor? Can you teach me to read better? Do you know any stories about princesses? Eleanor, who had spent years in the stifling silence of a Boston townhouse, found the child's constant energy to be a balm to her own wounded spirit. She taught Abby her letters using a stick in the dirt. She told her stories she remembered from her own childhood. She even managed to braid her hair, her clumsy fingers slowly learning the intricate pattern. One afternoon, as Eleanor was mending one of Abby's dresses, she pricked her finger with a needle. A small bead of blood welled up, and she put the finger to her mouth with a soft hiss. Abby, who was sitting on the floor nearby, looked up with wide, concerned eyes. "Did you hurt yourself?" "It's just a small prick, sweet girl," Eleanor assured her. "It will be fine." The little girl grew quiet, her expression thoughtful. "My first mommy, Mary, she used to sing when she pricked her finger. She said it made the hurt go away." Eleanor's hands stilled. It was the first time Abby had mentioned her mother by name. "That sounds like a lovely idea," Eleanor said gently. "What did she sing?" Abby shook her head, a sad look clouding her face. "I don't remember the words anymore. I try to, sometimes, but they float away like dandelion seeds." Just then, Samuel walked into the room. He had overheard the exchange. He froze, his face hardening into its familiar stoic mask. The brief, fragile warmth in the room evaporated. He looked at Abby, then at Eleanor, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Without a word, he turned and walked back outside, the slam of the screen door echoing behind him. Later that evening, the silence at the dinner table was heavier than usual. Abby, sensing the tension, was quiet. Eleanor tried to meet Samuel's eyes, but he kept his gaze fixed on his plate. The distance between them felt vast, a chasm of unspoken words and unshared pain. She wasn't a replacement for his late wife. She knew that. She had never wanted to be. But her presence here, her growing bond with his daughter, was clearly a painful reminder of all he had lost. She couldn't stay. She was a guest, a temporary nursemaid. Abby was better now. It was time to go. That night, after Abby was asleep, Eleanor packed her small carpet bag once more. It was a familiar, heartbreaking ritual. She folded her few belongings neatly. She wrote a short note, leaving it on the kitchen table. "Thank you for your kindness. Abby is a wonderful girl. I wish you both the best." She didn't sleep. She lay on the cot, listening to the house settle around her, memorizing the sounds. She thought she might cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Her heart just felt heavy, a dull, aching weight in her chest. She rose before dawn, determined to be gone before they woke, to avoid a painful goodbye. But when she stepped into the kitchen, she stopped in her tracks. Samuel was already there. He stood at the stove, a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. He wasn't dressed for work. He was just standing there, stirring a pot of porridge. He didn't look up as she entered, but she knew he was aware of her. "I thought you might be leaving," he said, his voice low. I am, she said quietly. Abby is well now. There's no reason for me to stay. He continued to stir the porridge, the rhythmic scrape of the spoon against the pot the only sound. Finally, he set the spoon down and turned to face her. His eyes were dark, shadowed with exhaustion and something else, something that looked like fear. Yesterday, he began, his voice rough. When Abby spoke of Mary, I didn't mean to. It's just, no one has spoken her name in this house for 2 years. He ran a hand through his hair. I didn't know how to hear it. Eleanor just nodded, her throat tight. He took a step toward her. I haven't known how to do much of anything since she's been gone. How to be a father, how to keep a home, how to live. He looked down at his own hands, large and calloused, hands that knew how to mend fences and plow fields, but not how to mend a broken heart. Abby hasn't smiled like she has this past week since before her mother. He couldn't finish the sentence. He looked back up at Eleanor, and for the first time, she saw past the grief, past the walls he had built. She saw a man who was profoundly and utterly lost. You didn't ask me to stay, she whispered. I didn't know how, he admitted, his voice cracking on the last word. Please, don't go. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a promise of a future. It was something simpler, and perhaps more honest. A plea, a confession of need. The beginning of a place not built on a lie or an accident, but chosen, however hesitantly. Eleanor looked at the packed bag in her hand. She looked at the weary, broken man standing before her, and she thought of the little girl asleep in the other room, the girl who had asked a stranger to be her mommy. Slowly, she walked to the table and set her bag on the floor. She didn't unpack it. Not yet. But she sat down, and when Samuel placed a bowl of warm porridge in front of her, she picked up the spoon and ate. They shared the meal in silence, but for the first time, it wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence filled with unspoken possibility. The days settled into a quiet rhythm, dictated by the rising and setting of the sun. Eleanor's presence in the house was no longer a surprise, but a simple fact. Her carpet bag remained by the door of the small room, a silent testament to the temporary nature of her stay. Yet, with each passing day, the dust on it grew a little thicker. She and Samuel moved around each other with a careful, unspoken courtesy. They were two strangers bound by the needs of a child, navigating the spaces of a home still heavy with the ghost of a memory. The conversations remained practical, centered on the daily tasks of survival. The hens aren't laying well. We'll need more firewood before the first snow. Abby has outgrown her boots. But beneath the surface of these mundane exchanges, something was shifting. Eleanor began to bring small changes to the house. She found a patch of wildflowers by the creek and placed a small bouquet in a jar on the kitchen table. The splash of color was so startling in the drab room that Samuel stopped in his tracks when he first saw it, staring at the flowers for a long moment before grunting and continuing on his way. But he didn't remove them. She started a new routine with Abby. Every evening, after the supper dishes were cleared, they would sit by the fire, and Eleanor would teach the little girl to read. Not from the Bible, but from old newspapers and almanacs that Samuel had stacked in a corner. Abby's quick mind soaked up the words, and her laughter as she sounded out a particularly difficult phrase began to fill the quiet evenings. Samuel would often sit in his chair on the other side of the hearth, mending a piece of leather tack or sharpening a tool. He would pretend not to listen, his head bent over his work. But Eleanor saw the way his hands would still when Abby read a sentence perfectly. She saw the corner of his mouth twitch in a near smile when the little girl would giggle. He was a spectator to the warmth that was slowly seeping back into his home, too cautious or too wounded to step into it himself. One afternoon, a traveling peddler's wagon rumbled up the path to the farmhouse. He was a cheerful man with a booming voice, his wagon a treasure trove of goods from the east. Abby's eyes went wide at the sight of colorful ribbons, jars of candy, and dolls with painted porcelain faces. Eleanor watched her, a pang of sadness in her heart. She had nothing to offer the child, not even a single penny for a piece of ribbon. Samuel came out onto the porch, his face set in a stern line. He traded a few of his tools for a bag of flour and some coffee, his dealings swift and economical. As the peddler was about to leave, Samuel cleared his throat. "Wait," he said, his voice low. He walked over to the wagon and picked up a small, simple cloth doll with yarn hair. He turned it over in his large hands, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at Eleanor. "A child needs a doll," he said, not to her, but to the air. He paid the peddler with a few extra tools. He didn't give the doll to Abby. He handed it to Eleanor. "You give it to her," he mumbled, before turning and striding toward the barn, as if embarrassed by the uncharacteristic act of tenderness. Eleanor's heart did a strange little flutter. She knelt and held the doll out to Abby. The little girl's face lit up with a joy so pure and radiant, it was almost painful to watch. She hugged the doll tightly. Then she threw her arms around Eleanor's neck. "Thank you, Mama," she whispered into Eleanor's shoulder. The word hung in the air between them, shocking and potent. Eleanor froze, her arms hovering, unsure of how to respond. It was the first time Abby had called her that. She looked over toward the barn, but Samuel was gone. She hugged Abby back, a fierce, protective feeling rising in her chest. She didn't correct the child. She couldn't. The incident with the doll marked a subtle but significant change. Samuel began to speak to her more directly. The instructions softened into requests. "Could you see to the mending, instead of 'the mending needs to be done'?" He even, on one occasion, asked for her opinion. "The roof on the barn has a leak," he said one evening. "I'm not sure whether to patch it again or try to replace the whole section before winter." Eleanor, surprised to be consulted, thought for a moment. "A patch might not hold through a heavy snow," she said carefully. "It might be more work now, but replacing it seems safer in the long run." He nodded slowly, considering her words. "You're right," he said, and that was that. But the fact that he had asked, that he had valued her judgment, felt like a small victory. One crisp autumn evening, after Abby had fallen asleep, Eleanor was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. The air was cold and clean, and the silence was peaceful. The screen door creaked open behind her, and Samuel stepped out. He didn't sit, but leaned against the porch railing a few feet away. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "She looks like her mother," he said finally, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Mary, Abby has her eyes, and her smile." It was the first time he had willingly spoken his late wife's name to her. Eleanor's heart ached for him. For the depth of the loss, she could only begin to imagine. "She must have been a wonderful woman," Eleanor said quietly. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "She was the sun," he said, struggling to find the words. "Everything was warmer when she was here, brighter. When she died," he trailed off, shaking his head slightly. "The light just went out. I didn't know how to turn it back on." He turned his head and looked at her, his eyes full of a sorrow so profound it stole her breath. "You brought a lamp with you, Miss Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When you walked into this house." He used her name, Miss Vance. It sounded formal, yet strangely intimate in the quiet darkness. "My name is Eleanor," she whispered. "Eleanor," he repeated, as if trying to name on for size. "Thank you for staying." He went back inside, leaving her alone with the stars and the echo of his words. That night, she moved her carpet bag from its place by the door and tucked it under the cot. It was a small gesture, but it felt momentous. She wasn't just staying until Abby was better anymore. She was just staying. The first snow came early that year, a thick, white blanket that transformed the rugged landscape into a world of pristine silence. The ranch became an island, cut off from the town of Redemption Creek and the world beyond. The days grew shorter, the nights longer. The small farmhouse, which had once felt so empty, now seemed a cozy, self-contained world. Life was pared down to its essentials, keeping the fire going, ensuring there was enough food, caring for the animals. The shared work and close quarters forged a new kind of intimacy between Eleanor and Samuel. They developed an easy rhythm, moving around each other in the small kitchen, passing tools back and forth in the barn, a silent understanding growing between them. One morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of a violent, racking cough. It wasn't Abby. It was coming from Samuel's room. She rushed to his door and knocked softly. "Samuel, are you all right?" A weak, hoarse voice answered. "Fine. Just a cold." But it wasn't just a cold. By midday, he was shivering with a fever so high it scared her. The strong, capable man who could lift hay bales as if they were feathers was laid low, his face pale and slick with sweat, his breathing shallow. For the second time, Eleanor found herself in the role of nurse. But this was different. Tending to the small, frail body of a child was one thing. Caring for this large, powerful man, who seemed so uncomfortable with his own vulnerability, was another. She brewed the same herbal teas she had made for Abby. She bathed his face with cool water. She sat by his bed, a silent vigil, as the snow fell outside. On the second night of his fever, he grew delirious. He thrashed in the bed, muttering names she didn't know, fragments of conversations from a life she had no part in. And then, he called out a name she didn't know. Mary, Mary, don't leave me. His voice was filled with such raw, desperate anguish that it felt like a physical blow. Eleanor's hand, which had been about to touch his forehead, froze in midair. She was an intruder here, a witness to a private grief that was not meant for her. She was a pale imitation, a shadow in the place of the woman he had loved, the woman he still called for in his fevered dreams. She almost left the room. The old feeling of being an outsider, of not belonging, washed over her. But then she looked at his face, contorted with pain, and she saw not just a grieving husband, but a man who was suffering, a man who was alone. And she was the only one there. She took a deep breath and gently placed the cool cloth on his forehead. "Chill," she whispered, her voice soft and steady. "It's all right. I'm here. You're not alone." He seemed to quiet at the sound of her voice. His thrashing subsided, and his breathing grew a little easier. She stayed there for hours, replacing the cloth, murmuring soothing words whenever he grew restless. She wasn't Mary. She could never be. But she could be Eleanor. And right now, Eleanor was what he had. The fever broke 2 days later. Samuel woke, weak and exhausted, but clear-eyed. He saw her sitting in the chair by his bed, her head slumped forward, asleep. A worn book lay open in her lap. He looked around the room. A basin of water was on the nightstand. A fresh log was smoldering in the small fireplace. He remembered flashes of the illness, the shivering, the nightmares, the suffocating heat. And through it all, he remembered a constant, calming presence, a cool hand on his brow, a soft voice cutting through the fog of his delirium. Eleanor stirred, blinking herself awake. She saw that he was watching her, and a faint blush colored her cheeks. "You're awake," she said, her voice a little husky from sleep. "How do you feel?" "Better," he said, his voice raspy. He tried to push himself up and winced. "Don't," she said, getting up and moving to his side. "You need a rest. You've been very ill." She helped him take a drink of water, her arms supporting his shoulders. The brief contact sent a jolt of awareness through them both. They were suddenly intensely conscious of their proximity, of the quiet intimacy of the sick room. He lay back against the pillows, his gaze never leaving her face. "You took care of me," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "Of course," she said simply. He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not an easy man, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and serious. "I'm broken in a lot of ways." "The world is a hard place, Samuel," she replied softly. "I think most of us are a little broken." He reached out, and, with a hand that was still trembling slightly, he touched her cheek. His calloused fingers were surprisingly gentle against her skin. It was the first time he had touched her with intention, with tenderness. It was a gesture that spoke more than words ever could. "I don't call for her anymore," he whispered, his eyes searching hers. "When I'm awake." Eleanor's heart swelled. She understood what he was trying to say, that he was starting to live in the present, not just in the past, that he was seeing her, not just the ghost of the woman who came before her. She covered his hand with her own, a silent acceptance of his unspoken confession. In the quiet of the snowbound farmhouse, with the storm still raging outside, two lonely, broken people had found a fragile, tentative peace. They were no longer just a man, a woman, and a child living under the same roof. They were beginning, ever so slowly, to feel like a family. With Samuel's recovery, a fragile peace settled over the farmhouse. The heavy snows of winter kept them isolated, a small world of three unto themselves. The roles they had fallen into, Eleanor as caregiver and homemaker, Samuel as provider and protector, solidified. She was no longer Miss Vance, the waiting lady from the train station. She was Eleanor, a steady presence who knew how to soothe Abby's nightmares and make the sparse pantry seem plentiful. He was no longer Mr. Miller, the grim-faced stranger. He was Samuel, a man whose rare smiles were beginning to reach his eyes, a man who would silently add an extra log to the fire when he saw her shiver. The harshness of the Montana winter was a crucible, forcing them to rely on one another completely. When a blizzard raged for 3 days, shaking the very foundations of the house, it was Samuel's strength that kept them safe, his hands tirelessly securing the barn doors and checking the roof. But it was Eleanor's calm that kept the fear at bay, her voice a soothing anchor as she read stories to Abby by the flickering lamplight, making the howling wind seem like a distant beast that could not touch them. They learned each other's habits, the small, unspoken languages of cohabitation. She learned that he took his coffee black, with no sugar. He learned that she hummed softly to herself when she was kneading bread. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his mood by the set of his jaw. He learned that her quiet demeanor hid a fierce, resilient strength. One evening, they sat at the table, the lamp casting a warm, golden glow. Abby was on the floor by the hearth, carefully drawing pictures on a piece of slate with a nub of chalk. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that no longer felt empty but full of unspoken understanding. Samuel cleared his throat, breaking the quiet. "The spring thaw will come in a few weeks," he said, his gaze fixed on the table. "The roads to town will be clear." Eleanor's hands, which were mending a tear in his work shirt, stilled. The unspoken implication hung in the air. The train would be running again. Her reason for staying, first Abby's illness, then his, then the impassable snow, was melting away with the ice. She could leave. There was nothing, officially, to keep her here. "I see," she said, her voice carefully neutral. She picked up her needle again, focusing on the tiny, precise stitches. He seemed to sense the shift in her, the sudden tension in the room. "I just meant, we'll need supplies," he said, his voice a little rough. "Flour, salt, seeds for the garden." He paused. "I thought, perhaps you and Abby would like to ride into town with me." It was a clumsy offering, but an offering nonetheless. It wasn't a dismissal. It was an invitation, an assumption that she would still be here when the snows cleared. A small, warm bloom of relief spread through Eleanor's chest. "I would like that very much," she said softly. The trip to Redemption Creek felt like a return to a different world, a different life. As their wagon rumbled down the main street, Eleanor saw the train station, the splintered bench where she had spent 5 days waiting for a lie to unfold. It seemed like a lifetime ago. The woman who had sat there, alone and hopeless, felt like a stranger to her now. Townspeople turned to stare as they passed. Their glances were no longer just curious. They were sharp with speculation. Eleanor Vance, the abandoned mail-order bride, was now sitting on the wagon seat next to Samuel Miller, the town's most solitary widower, with his daughter nestled between them. Whispers followed them, like the dust stirred up by the wagon wheels. Inside the general store, the talk was a low buzz that ceased the moment they walked in. Mrs. Gable, the station master's wife and the town's primary source of news, gave Eleanor a look that was a mixture of pity and disapproval. Well, she said, her voice laced with false sweetness. "Look what the thaw brought in. We were all so worried about you, dearie. Thought you'd gone back east." "I've been staying at the Miller Ranch," Eleanor said, her chin held high. She would not be ashamed of the choices she had made. "So we've heard," Mrs. Gable sniffed, turning her attention to Samuel. "A man needs help, of course, especially with a child to raise. But folks are talking, Samuel. It's not proper. A single woman, living under your roof." Samuel's face darkened. He placed a heavy bag of flour on the counter with a thud that made the woman jump. "Eleanor is my guest," he said, his voice a low growl that held a clear warning. "And she is Abby's governess. If folks have something to say, they can say it to me." He paid for their supplies, his movements clipped and angry. As they left the store, Eleanor could feel the weight of every eye on her back. She had thought she had found a place, a safe harbor. But she saw now that their small, self-contained world was vulnerable to the harsh judgments of others. She was not Samuel's wife. She was not Abby's mother. In the eyes of the world, she was a woman of questionable reputation, living in a scandalous arrangement. The ride back to the ranch was silent and tense. Samuel's anger simmered beside her, a palpable heat. Eleanor felt a familiar cold dread begin to creep back into her heart. Had she been a fool to stay? Had she traded one kind of ruin for another? When they arrived back at the farmhouse, Samuel spoke, his voice tight. "I'm sorry for that." For what she said. "It's what they're all thinking," Eleanor said, her voice flat. She only said it aloud. He stopped, turning to face her. His eyes were blazing with a fierce, protective light she had never seen before. "Then let them think it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't care what they think. Do you?" The question caught her off guard. Did she care? She cared about the shame, the judgment. She cared about the stain on her reputation. But when she looked at him, at this difficult, broken, and honorable man who had offered her shelter when she had none, when she thought of Abby, asleep in the back of the wagon, her small hand clutching the cloth doll, she found that the whispers of strangers seemed very far away. "No," she said, meeting his gaze. "No, I don't care." Something in his expression softened. The anger was replaced by a look of raw vulnerability. He took a half-step toward her, as if he was going to say something more, something important. But just then, Abby stirred, and the moment was broken. But the conversation, and the challenge it represented, lingered between them. The unspoken question of her place in their home had been brought out into the open. Governess, guest. These were temporary titles, labels that didn't fit the reality of what she had become to them. A few weeks later, as Eleanor was hanging laundry on the line, she saw a rider approaching. It wasn't Samuel, who was out mending the west fence line. It was a stranger, a man in a dusty suit and a bowler hat, looking entirely out of place in the rugged landscape. He dismounted and approached her, his smile thin and unpleasant. "Miss Eleanor Vance?" he asked. "Yes," she said, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. "My name is Silas Croft," he said, tipping his hat. "I'm from the Matrimonial Correspondence Agency in St. Louis." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The agency, the source of the lie that had brought her here. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding regarding your arrangement with Mr. Jacob Bennett," he continued, his eyes roving over the farmhouse, the barn, taking in the scene with a predatory air. "A most unfortunate clerical error. It seems Mr. Bennett's letter was intended for a different town altogether." "There is no Jacob Bennett," Eleanor said, her voice cold. It was a lie. Mr. Croft gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "An unfortunate fiction, perhaps, but the contract you signed with the agency is very real. You paid for placement, Miss Vance, and the agency prides itself on fulfilling its contracts." He smiled again, a flash of white teeth. "We have found another match for you. A respectable merchant in Virginia City, a Mr. Abernathy. He is waiting for you. The agency has already purchased your ticket. You are to leave on the morning train, 3 days from now." The words hit her like a physical blow. Leave? A new match? She stared at him, speechless. She was a piece of property, a parcel to be delivered to the correct address. "I'm not going," she said, her voice shaking with a fury she didn't know she possessed. Mr. Croft's smile vanished. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice, Miss Vance. Your contract is legally binding. If you refuse the placement, you will be in breach. The agency would be forced to sue you for the fee, the travel expenses, and damages. You would be ruined, destitute." He let the threat hang in the air. "Besides," he added, his gaze sweeping over her again, "a woman in your situation should be grateful for the opportunity to secure a respectable position. A widower's charity is a fickle thing." He handed her an envelope containing the train ticket and a letter of introduction to Mr. Abernathy. "I will have a man here with a wagon in 3 days' time to escort you to the station. I suggest you have your bag packed." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Eleanor standing by the clothesline, the white sheets flapping in the wind like ghosts. The world she had so carefully, so tentatively built, was about to be torn apart. She was trapped by a piece of paper she had signed in desperation, trapped by the judgment of a world that had no place for a woman on her own. She had escaped a lie, only to be caught in the merciless gears of a contract. Her fragile hope, which had just begun to bloom in this unlikely soil, withered into despair. She had 3 days. 3 days until she would be forced to leave the only home she had ever really known. The next 2 days passed in a haze of quiet desperation. Eleanor went through the motions of her daily chores, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. Every task, baking bread, feeding the chickens, mending a tear in Abby's dress, felt like a farewell. She watched the way the morning light fell across the kitchen floor, memorized the sound of Abby's laughter as she chased a butterfly, and burned the image of Samuel's silhouette against the setting sun into her memory. She was a ghost in a life that was no longer hers. She couldn't bring herself to tell them what had happened. How could she explain that their fragile world was about to be shattered by a legal document she had signed in a different lifetime? How could she look at Abby's trusting face and tell her she was leaving? The words would not form. Samuel knew something was wrong. The easy peace that had settled between them was gone, replaced by a tense, sorrowful silence. He watched her, his brow furrowed with concern. She was distant, her smile strained, her eyes shadowed with a pain she refused to share. He would find her staring out the window, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. When he tried to approach her, she would flinch and find an excuse to be busy. On the evening of the second day, the air in the farmhouse was thick with unspoken words. Abby, sensitive to the tension, was subdued, playing quietly with her doll by the hearth. Eleanor was packing her small carpet bag, her movements slow and deliberate. Each folded item felt like a betrayal. Samuel stood in the doorway, watching her. He could bear the silence no longer. "What is it, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "What's wrong?" She kept her back to him, unable to face the question in his eyes. "Nothing is wrong," she lied, her voice thin. I think it's just time for me to go. The snows have cleared. There's no reason for me to stay any longer." "No reason," he said, stepping into the room. He sounded incredulous, hurt. "After all this? After the winter? Abby, she thinks of you as her mother." "I think of you." He stopped, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "That's a lie. There's no reason." Finally, she turned, and he saw the tears streaming down her face. Her composure crumbled, and the story came tumbling out. The man from the agency, the contract, the threat of ruin, the respectable merchant in Virginia City. He listened, his face hardening into a granite mask. The concern was replaced by a cold, quiet fury that was more frightening than any shout. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight. "So you're just going to leave?" he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Without a word? You were going to let them take you?" "I have no choice," she cried, her voice breaking. "The contract is legal. He said he would ruin me. What else can I do? I have nothing, Samuel. No money, no family. My reputation is already in tatters. I cannot fight them." "You are not alone," he said, his voice a low growl. He crossed the room in 2 strides and took her by the shoulders. His grip was firm, anchoring. "This is your home. You are not some piece of property to be shipped from one man to another. This ends now." The next morning, Eleanor woke to a house filled with a sense of grim determination. Samuel was already up, dressed in his Sunday clothes. He was cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and methodical. The sight sent a shiver of fear down her spine. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. "I'm going to make sure the man who comes for you leaves empty-handed," he said, his eyes like chips of flint. Just as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, a wagon rumbled up the path. It wasn't the smarmy Mr. Croft, but a burly, thuggish-looking man with a sour expression. He pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, his eyes scanning the farmhouse with an air of impatient authority. Samuel stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. Eleanor and Abby stood in the doorway behind him. "I'm here for the woman," the man grunted, not bothering with pleasantries. "Vance. She has a train to catch." "She's not going," Samuel said, his voice calm and even. The man's eyes narrowed. He looked past Samuel to Eleanor, then back again. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Ah, I see. Got your feet under the table. Have you, sweetheart? Found a better offer." He spat on the ground. "Doesn't matter. She has a contract. She's coming with me, one way or another." He took a step toward the porch. "That's far enough," Samuel said. He didn't raise the rifle, but his hand tightened on the stock. The message was unmistakable. The man hesitated, his bravado wavering in the face of Samuel's cold resolve. He was a bully, used to intimidating desperate women, not confronting a man with a rifle and a look in his eye that promised violence. "This ain't your affair, Miller," he snarled. "You'll be bringing a world of trouble down on yourself. The agency has lawyers. And I have a rifle," Samuel replied simply. "This is my land. The woman is under my protection. Now, you can get back in your wagon and ride out of here, or you can be carried out. The choice is yours." For a long, tense moment, the two men stared each other down. The only sound was the wind whistling through the pines. The man from the agency licked his lips, his eyes darting from Samuel's face to the rifle and back again. Finally, with a muttered curse, he turned, climbed back into his wagon, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Eleanor sagged against the doorframe, a wave of relief so powerful it left her weak. It was over. The threat was gone. Samuel turned and looked at her, his expression softening. He leaned the rifle against the wall and walked toward her. He stopped in front of her, his eyes searching hers. The silence stretched between them, thick with all the things that had been left unsaid for so long. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. It was Mary's. It had been on the mantelpiece, in the empty picture frame, all this time. He opened it. One side held a tiny, faded portrait of his late wife. The other side was empty. "This house has been full of ghosts for too long," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked from the locket to her. "I can't offer you an easy life, Eleanor. I'm a simple man, and this is a hard land, and I will never forget Mary. But my heart, it's a quiet place, and it's been empty for a long time. I find it's not so quiet anymore when you're here." He took a deep breath, his vulnerability laid bare. "I'm asking you to stay, not as a guest, not as a governess, but as my wife, as Abby's mother." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming joy. She had come to this place with nothing but a ticket and a lie. She had been abandoned, made a fool of, and threatened with ruin. And in the midst of it all, she had found something more real, more true than any contract or promise. She had found a home. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Yes, Samuel. Yes." He gently took her hand. It was no longer the hand of a governess, soft and pale. It was the hand of a homesteader, calloused and capable. He slipped his other arm around her waist, drawing her close. From behind them, a small voice piped up. "Does this mean you'll be my mommy for real now?" They both looked down. Abby stood there, her big, green eyes wide with hope, clutching her cloth doll. Eleanor knelt, pulling the little girl into a fierce hug. "Yes, sweet girl," she whispered into her messy braids. "For real, forever and always." Samuel knelt beside them, his large hand resting on both their shoulders, enclosing them in a circle of warmth and protection. For the first time, the three of them were not just individuals bound by circumstance, but a family, forged in hardship and bound by love. The lonely mail-order bride had lost all hope on a splintered bench in a desolate town. But she had been found, not by the man she was promised, but by a little girl in dusty boots who had seen a waiting angel and asked her to be a mommy. And in answering that impossible, heartfelt plea, Eleanor Vance had finally, truly, come home. Sometimes, the life we pray for isn't the one we get, but the one we truly need. Eleanor's journey began with a lie, but it ended with a love that was truer than any promise written on paper. If this story of hope and unexpected family touched your heart, we would be so grateful if you would give this video a like. It truly helps our channel grow. What was your favorite part of Eleanor and Samuel's story? Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. We love hearing from you and read every single one. And if you'd like to enjoy more heartwarming tales of love and resilience from the Old West, please consider subscribing to our channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss the next story we have waiting for you. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next chapter.